Good afternoon, class. I'm going to provide a little lecturette here, as I mentioned I might do in class today. I did not quite get through my comments of the West African kingdoms. I wanted to spend just a little time talking about the kingdom of Mali. And Mali is going to be an important kingdom. It becomes increasingly Islamic and Arabic by the 13th century, and that distinguishes it somewhat from its predecessor, Ghana, which was the leading empire of West Africa up until the 11th century. And Ghana essentially falls into an increasing state of instability and then finally collapse by the 11th century. Our history seems to suggest that the nomadic Berbers, who were Muslim merchants who were making their way down south across the Saharan desert to conduct trade with the Ghanaian people, that through a series of differences and cultural differences, eventually the Berbers will bring war and resistance to Ghanaian rule, and by 1075 or so, that crumbles. Now, out of that, in the next century or two, there will be born a new and equally impressive kingdom, the Kingdom of Mali. And the Kingdom of Mali in ancient West Africa, I think it's worth noting, is distinct from Ghana largely because it's bigger. It controls more of the gold trafficking of that region. More on that in just a minute. Also, it's going to increasingly turn its trade attention toward slaves. And so from 1100 to 1400, we're going to see still a relatively small volume of traffic and trade in slaves, but one that nonetheless serves as probably an important precursor, an important sort of distant early echo of what will become by the 15th century and 16th century a powerful slave trade once Europe finally starts to have greater interaction with Africa. So as far as Mali, we see here on the slide, you can see that it's roughly a 200-year time of dominance and power within the region. Our sources, one of our major sources, is an oral source. It's the oral epic of Sundiata, which is something that was being told in the days that the earlier Muslim traders and travel writers encounter Mali. It's also something that isn't committed to writing until actually the 20th century. So the Epic of Sundiata has remained oral throughout most of its history. And of course, the griot, who are these essentially African bards who play the role of telling the lineage and great stories and accomplishments of kings in West Africa, are going to be an important part of the Sundiata epic. And the griot are also worthy, it's worth mentioning that they're an important part of the religious and spiritual worldview of West Africa as well, because it fell to them to memorize and recite the lineage of the great kings and ancestors and rulers, because by honoring and venerating them, the African people were essentially contributing to their limited worldview of an afterlife and what became of the great souls of West African society. So the griot, they had a powerful role that they played. So when we get to talking specifically about the Kingdom of Mali, it's worth noting that its earliest and legendary leader is the great king Sundiata, and the griot, as they tell the oral tradition, oftentimes included some rather impressive and unusual accounts of the early, or I should say the very young, Sundiata. He was born to a powerful family. His father was a king, and the king's wife, according to the oral tradition, was a humpback. So she was unique in the sense that her posture and her physical form were somewhat distinct from most other women of her day, presumably. It's also worth noting that the young Sundiata was very slow to start walking, so not until he turned the age of 7. And in the oral tradition, this sort of sets Sundiata apart. One has a very distinct mother, and he's unique for being very slow to start walking. However, the story also holds that at age 7, he does some superhuman accomplishments, including a very heavy iron bar that traditionally took 6 men to carry, as it's recounted in the Epic of Sundiata. Sundiata is able to lift up this bar with one hand and then walk. So he goes on to become a great warrior, but through a series of jealousies and anger by Sundiata's fathers, one of Sundiata's father's wives that was not Sundiata's mother. Okay, this is a society where men had multiple wives. Sundiata was shut out of power for a time, but as he distinguishes himself as a great warrior, he will come back and then lay claim, and he will rule the empire for a brief period of time as one of its most celebrated leaders. Then our attention can skip ahead a little bit. We know that Mali was a great gold trading region. They assessed taxes on all the gold that both came to Mali and left Mali, so it was usually sort of a double tax. That wealth was used to build the cities and the governmental offices of the king and his officials, and Mali for a period of 200 years or so was a fabulously wealthy part of the world. This actually becomes very evident under the reports of Ibn Battuta, who was a important voice, a Islamic travel writer, who reports he follows in the wake of an important visit that one of the great Malian leaders, Mansa Musa, makes to the Hajj. Mansa Musa converts to Islam. He's a Malian king, and he converts to Islam and of course has to make his pilgrimage to Mecca in the form of the Hajj. And as he does this, he gathers quite a bit of attention. The people who he encounters, when they see his entourage and the tremendous gold and wealth that he brings with him, it makes Mali, the kingdom of Mali, more of a household name throughout the Islamic world of that time, and thus Mali gains some credibility. Not long thereafter, Ibn Battuta launches a visit to Mali to sort of investigate and see what all is true about this. And he talks then to the grandson of Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was the great chieftain who had made the visit to Mecca for his Hajj in the early 14th century. So Ibn Battuta notices a number of things. One, he notices that in the hot, dry environment that these Malian people rely tremendously upon salt. In fact, they even build their houses, in some cases, out of salt. It was very precious in this hot climate because, of course, the nutrients and natural salts that it helped the people replenish. Slaves in Mali mined salt. They lived on camel meat, on dates, millet. A lot of that was imported due to the gold and slave trade that the Malian people participated in. So from 1100 to 1400, about 5,500 slaves will cross the Sahara as part of the Malian slave trade, and gold will also be one of the main accomplishments of Mali. By starting in 1000 and continuing on, it's the rulers of Mali that convert to Islam. We heard the story in our source from yesterday of the conversion of Sundiata's father, and so that starts to bring this region more closely into the orbit. And by 1450, the Songhai replace over